Yeah, you're audible. Do you consent to recording?
Yes.
Cool.
Do you want me to say my speaker position?
Yeah, you can put on the chat.
All right, cool.
Yeah. Opening up, are you here?
Yes, we're here.
We are here.
Okay, do you consent to recording as well?
Yes, we do consent to being recorded.
I see that CG is here. CO is also here. Okay, then I think we can start with the round. I'm Rahul. I'll be judging you today. I think we have 2 more judges with us. Could they introduce themselves as well?
Okay, hi, I'm Aaron. I will be one of the panelists. My preferred pronouns are he or him.
Hi, I'm Vetri. I'm also one of the panelists. My preferred pronouns are he or him too.
Yeah, I think that's cool. Then we can start with the round. Prime Minister, you have me. PM, you can start when you're ready.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The Iran deal is a scam. The Iran deal is a deal that's meant to benefit only the US, and I'm going to prove to you today why it's better for number one, it's in US's incentive to pull out of the deal, and number two, how it will also benefit Iran in the long term, principally and literally, right? A few things before I move on to my arguments. Number one, some characterization about what's happening, right? So the Iran-US history. In 2011, the US found Iran partaking in nuclear research, and that was very, very concerning for them. So under the Obama administration, they said that they didn't want it to happen, so they implemented the Iran deal. But at the same time, near the course of 2016 to 2017, there have been still reports of Iran partaking in nuclear programs outside of the deal's interval, or like within the deal's interval during the Obama administration. So because of that, I think that this basically makes the deal not useful and null, right? Secondly, we have to notice that Iran is at its core a very unstable country and a very unstable government. Notice that Iran has no proper social classes, and because of that, it's very hard for the country to perform and very hard for the country to perform as one unit. Notice that there are things like Shia terrorist groups that exist in Iran, and for those reasons, I think that Iran shouldn't be able to partake in any deal where the safety of the world is concerned. On our side, opening our government has 2 principles. Number one, we have to prove that Iran deal does more harm than good, and we also have the stance to prove. We also have the burden to prove that both Iran and US and how like Iran, the US, and the rest of the world will benefit from the US pulling out of this Iran-US deal. I have 2 arguments for you today. Number one, the incentive for US, and number 2, the incentive for Iran, and how both things affect the world and why it's in both parties' interest to pull out of the deal. My second speaker will elaborate more on the second point. So the incentive for US. Before we move on, some things to clarify. Number one, the US is always very wary of countries that have nuclear programs, right? And because of that, there's constantly deals that go on to try to denuclearize countries and to make sure that the world's peace isn't threatened. The principle behind this is very simple. Even if a country has no incentive or doesn't have a reason to bomb another country, as long as they have the capability to do it, it's in the US's interest to stop them from having that capability. Even if China doesn't have an incentive to bomb states around it, the fact that it can do such a thing is something that's very scary for US, and because of that, US will do everything in its power to ensure that countries like this do not have the power to do stuff like that. And the main reason is because it threatens world peace and it threatens the sovereignty of US as a country. So 3 levels analysis for you today. Number one, as to why it's in an incentive of US to pull out of the deal. Number one, notice that Iran is the number 1 culprit, right? In the number 1 culprit in terms of nuclearization in the Middle East. Notice that even after the Iran deal was implemented during the Obama administration, Iran still carried out explosive tests in things like villages nearby. And even if the tests were small, and even if the tests were minuscule, or even if the tests were hidden under the covers or pushed under the table, the fact of the matter is that Iran still carried out explosive tests. I think that the reason behind this is because Iran, at its core, isn't unified. Meaning, even if the government agrees to the criteria of a deal, the fact is that the government doesn't have control over its entire country. Things like Shia terrorist groups still have the integrity and the freedom to do whatever they want, and this is why the Iran deal doesn't work. Secondly, the comparative for government side. When you pull out, notice that you implement sanctions on Iran again. This makes it so that the other countries of the world are able to check and balance Iran and check and balance things that go into the country, things that go out of the country. The influx of materials that go into the country, things like the import of certain metals to create explosive or things that could be turned into explosive. Those are things that you can do on government side. Notice that on our side, when you reduce the money for them to do things like R&D, you also decrease the chance for them to nuclearize. Secondly, how the check and balance on opposition looks like. Notice that once a deal is set, the US basically assumes that Iran doesn't do anything bad. And this is the premise of the deal, right? They assume that Iran won't do anything, and they assume that Iran won't do any nuclearization programs in the future, which is what's at its core wrong with the deal. Because notice that on their side, number one, they have no way of ensuring that Iran won't do anything, because they basically take away the only leverage of Iran. No, thank you. They take away the only leverage of Iran, which is the sanctions that US can place on Iran in the first place. But secondly, they take away any way of regulating their actions, meaning they don't have any control over what Iran does, and even if it's indirectly, they don't have any way of controlling the people that operate inside Iran and the people that operate outside Iran, or like the terrorist groups inside Iran, right? So why is it better on our side when you regulate them? Because notice that when you can directly control Iran, you control a very volatile state. You control a state that doesn't have a proper government, a proper leading power, right? You control these things. It's like a little baby that likes to cry, a little baby that likes to do a lot of weird things because it's a baby. Because I'm not saying Iran's a baby, but in comparison, the baby here is Iran. And because Iran is a baby and doesn't have a proper government to control the baby, notice that the US, number one, has a natural incentive to control them, because the US is like kind of their big brother of the world. But not only that, right? It's important for you to take care of a state and to make sure that the state doesn't have any capabilities of doing anything volatile in the first place. But more than that, it's also in US's incentive to stop the spread of these terrorist groups in Iran, right? Because notice that these terrorist groups that exist in Iran are very, very radical. And these terrorist groups are willing to do anything when it comes to their power to spread their awareness and to spread their terrorist ideologies. This is bad because the US wants to stop the spread of ideologies, whether it's in the Middle East or whether it's in the US. In general, most countries want to stop the spread of terrorism. So we think that under those circumstances, it's in the US's incentive for them to stop terrorist groups in Iran by controlling the influx of things that are going in and out of the country, and controlling the ability for terrorist groups to spread their ideas in the first place through things like campaigns or resources or money to carry out campaigns in the first place. Secondly, the incentive for Iran. 2 points of analysis for you today. Number one, notice that Iran was basically forced into the deal in the first place. They, number one, first off, I've already pointed this out, but they don't have a proper government system. So even if the government agrees to it, it doesn't mean that the entire country agrees to it. But secondly, they were forced into the deal in the first place. US is a very, very big country in comparison, a country that is capable of taking down Iran when they wanted to, if there's a proper reasoning to it. So because of this, I think that when Iran went to the deal in the first place, it wasn't on a voluntarily basis. It was more of like a gun pointed to the back of your head. If you don't join the deal, you are literally going to get screwed by the US, right? So because of that, I think it's not a very beneficial deal for Iran in the first place. Or even if it's a beneficial deal now, in the future, the US can easily just do whatever they want and create policies that will screw Iran in the future, and because they don't have anything to control them, because Iran doesn't have any way to protect themselves against the US. But secondly, it's principally wrong for Iran. Notice that Iran as a country, sure, they may be radical, they may be inconsistent, but they're still a country that wants to be self-sufficient. They still want to be a country that is proud of their ideologies and proud of the people that live inside the country. So in opposition, when you're forced to walk with a leash on your neck, basically saying because you signed the deal, you have no freedom, you must do whatever the US says. Principally, that's bad for Iran, because Iran as a country has pride and has sovereignty that you need to protect on both sides, because this debate is a value judgment debate. The comparative on our side is that when Iran in the government, sure, they are under sanctions, sure, they're being leashed and they're being constantly under control by the government of US, but it also means that they're not a dog for anyone. They're not restricted and they're not leashed on the neck. They're not forced to do anything and they're not expected to do anything by any other countries. And it's important as in terms of the sovereignty for Iran in the first place. For all those reasons, I think that no matter what, this Iran deal does more harm than good, and opening governments should win this debate.
Thank you for that speech. We'll now move on to the leader of opposition. You can start when you're ready.
Am I audible? Hello? Hello? Can anyone hear me?
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. On side government, they came up to you and told you how we are putting Iran on a leash, and Iran's our dog and things like that. We say it's fine because Iran is a very unstable, aggressive dog. I mean, a country that we need to keep under control. that we need to that we need to control basically because we don't want things to get out of hand, right? And that's what we're trying to do on side op. All right. So rebuttals integrated, by the way. All right. So first thing I'm going to do is talk about sanctions. So like, what do sanctions look like? So sanctions look like a penalty that is imposed for disobeying like a certain rule or disobeying something that like the UN doesn't want you to do, right? So basically, it's harmful for the economy of Iran, and I'll explain to you why that is so important later. All right. So let's talk about the deal itself first, right? So the deal happens when Iran denuclearizes and other countries will lift their sanctions. That's when the deal happens. So when US doesn't uphold their end of the bargain, they don't uphold their promise, right? So like what obligation does Iran have to like follow or like to continue to adhere to this deal, right? It's more likely they are going to go against the deal. They're more likely going to turn violent, going to become unstable, and things and violence is more likely to happen because and like the recreation of these nuclear weapons are more likely to happen because they have no obligation because US doesn't uphold their end of the deal, right? And because understand that this deal is only in place when all these countries agree to not place sanctions, right? So now not only can no other country question Iran and no other country can pose a check and balance on Iran because like they don't have any rights to because they literally broke the deal, right? So then this is the point in which Iran can finally create these nuclear weapons and so on without any proper like check and balance on them. No one can see what they're doing because no other country has a right to because they literally broke the deal, right? So that's why this is so important. So, all right. So let's talk about so. All right, let's talk about how this poses a threat to countries like US, right? So, and also basically the entire world. So we have to know that like there's a lot of tension between US and Iran in the first place, like how they killed the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, right? And things like now how they're breaking this deal and many other things, right? So um, and also notice that even the PM told you that how how Iran is a very unstable country. There's things like terrorists and things like that. There's not proper people in charge, things like that. So it's already from the very get go, we told you that Iran is an unstable country, right? So understand what happens when an unstable country gets a huge amount of power, like basically these nuclear weapons, right? So it's very easy and it's very likely for like Iran to use these powers against the US or like other countries when it needs to, right? And understand no. And understand that because Iran has this power, it's easier for them to form relations with people in the with other countries in the Middle East, and it's also very threatening to have like a group of countries forming an alliance against another country and so on, right? This can not only happen to US, it can also happen to other countries, like other countries where Iran, like the Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia, they can also like use weapons against them, things like that. Because we already told you like how it's so unstable and it's very easy for them to make this. It's very easy for these things to happen because no one can check and balance, right? So basically, what happens is violence happen, wars happen, right? Things like that are very likely to happen because there is no check and balance. No one is seeing what they're doing, right? So, okay, let's also talk about how like sanctions like anger the Iran in general, because like understand that most of Iran's economy comes from like the Strait of Hormuz. Like it's basically a strait where it allows for um, the export of oil to certain countries, right? So like sanctions are also placed when export import happens, things like that, right? So what happens is this export for oil becomes very expensive, and they are unable to export, or like the export price becomes very higher. I mean, becomes very
Iran,
high.
please.
And no. And the economy of these countries, the economy of Iran drops like drastically, right? And it actually like angers them, and it also makes them furthermore unstable, right? Because like now even the economy of the country is dying. So what happens when you lift the sanctions is when you lift the sanctions, people are able to export its oil freely, and they become a stable country, right? I mean, they have a stable economy, right? They have less incentive to go against other countries. Like on our side, when you have these deals, right, what happens is like even though those small tests happen, or like whatever Chris mentioned about how they are like some like they are having a small test about these nuclear weapons somewhere in Iran. We say that on our side, we are able to, at least on our side, we are able to go in. Okay, no, first thing, understand that these are already on a very small scale. No, second thing, we talked to you about how um, now we actually can do a check and balance, meaning other countries can go into Iran to basically stop these things from happening, because because they broke a small amount of their deal, right? So because this happens, other countries are able to interfere. On your side, when the deal doesn't exist, you can't interfere in what Iran is doing, and that's the main problem. All right, the second thing Chris brought up was about Iran's sovereignty, right? About the control. No, not yet. Wait, so it's already 6, I think. Yeah. And then basically this is not important, and not and the economy of Iran, or the of the Iran not being angry, is probably the more important thing, and economy is the reason. Economy is the main thing, right? Not the sovereignty. uh okay, so what have I proved to you today? I proved to you how on your side Iran is further angered and has further provocations for them to use these weapons in a very bad manner, to and basically creates a worse world. On our side, we keep Iran in check, and they are unable to do these kinds of things. Of It's very minimized, and that's why go with side opening opposition.
Thank you so much for that speech. We'll now move ahead to our next speaker, which is the Deputy Prime Minister. You can start when you're ready.
Am I audible?
Yeah, yes, you are.
So good afternoon to the Honorable Adjudicator, fellow team the opponents. My name is Kate, and I'll be debating a motion that this House believes that the implementation of the Iran deal with its original terms unchanged will bring more harm than good. And we strongly agree with this motion. So before I go to my points, I would first like to state a rebuttal. So the opposition side thought about how if Iran does bad things, then US can check and balance these things through a deal. And technically, you can't really do this because you can't check and balance through deals, and you can only check and balance through sanctions, which I will explain later on my speech. So, for example, there's this thing called the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran literally placed bombs on the district to prevent other countries from entering it. So this happens when the deal goes on, which is what I'll explain later on my point, saying that the deal, there is no point of keeping the deal in the first place. So now, okay, on to my point, they're saying that there is no point of the deal. So it will not stop Iran from becoming a nuclear state in the future, okay? So there have been reports that Iran was still testing missiles after signing that agreement, okay? And this shows that Iran doesn't exactly stop doing whatever it's doing. It just slows down the process, okay? And they kind of give you like an empty promise and they never fulfill. So, like what my first speaker has said, the government is unsteady. So they might give a promise that where they have never really completed or done. So Iran kind of has a record of not following agreements and of not following international agreements. And this means that the leadership, like the government of Iran, is more likely to hide
POI?
and these elements, no. So this is status quo. Okay, so in a fairy tale world, you cannot just assume that when US is going to lift up these sanctions, Iran will just magically follow whatever the US is going to say. Okay, so this is status quo. Okay, Iran, there's already have been reports and evidence saying that Iran has still doing things under US notice and still doing explosive and missiles and all that stuff, which proves that there is no point of the deal and it's not going to benefit both sides. So this will only waste the US time to try and take out sanctions, as they know that if they take out, okay, if the US take out sanctions and the Iran claims that it is said to be to denuclearize whatever they're doing. On opposition side, no, on government side, we believe that this isn't true because this only provides a short-term solution to a long-term problem. Okay, so furthermore, it does not make any attempt to normalize relationship between both of these countries. Okay, so this Iran nuclear deal does nothing to change that, and the only purpose is lifting sanctions for restrictions in the nuclear program. And I've already said over and over again that Iran doesn't really have that promise, and that they doesn't really claim that even if they said that they denuclearize all of these explosives and all of these bombs and stuff, there is no way of telling that Iran will exactly follow whatever they're giving their word to, which shows that having this deal isn't exactly helpful to both Iran and to US. Okay, so it doesn't change the way that Iran looks at US, and there's no point of the deal because first thing first, Iran's government is good at hiding whatever they do, and so when you try to when US try to remove sanctions from Iran and Iran saying that they nuclearize their bombs in return to this, there is no way that you could say that Iran is going to exactly follow whatever they're saying. And this means that the point of the deal is absolutely useless. Okay, and now my second point is that the US pulling out and imposing heavy sanctions on Iran is the best and better way. So when US pulled out, according to the Infoslide, Donald Trump has, for example, imposed heavy sanctions, right? So I find this rather better than them just pulling out the entire sanction in the first place and letting Iran keep their word, saying that they would denuclearize all of these bombs. And so I find this better because it allows the US to be able to minimize whatever Iran does. So this means that the US will be able to, like, for example, control these research and developments that could be happening in Iran when you impose these heavy sanctions, right? And this would be beneficial to everyone, as now US kind of has control towards like Iran not being able to make any more bombs or any more explosives. Okay, so now, right, I'm going to summarize what my speech has included. Okay, so what I said before, the point of the deal is completely useless because Iran doesn't exactly keep its promises and its words like it said that it would. And if US were to just let's let go of these sanctions and remove it, and then assume that Iran is exactly going to denuclearize these bombs, okay, there isn't like a way where you can say that this is actually going to happen, and this only makes it even worse for both sides of the country because like I said before, there have been evidence and reports that Iran does dirty things under US even under the agreement, okay, and this only proves saying that Iran doesn't really like I said before, doesn't really try to do anything to stop them denuclearizing these explosives and bombs because first thing first, their country is unstable. Okay, the government is unstable, and they have, for example, terrorist organizations that still continue to do whatever they do, even if this deal is being imposed. So the government can't exactly control, like what my first speaker has said, they cannot exactly control how this country is going to operate, how they're going to react. So there could be terrorist organizations that are still making bombs and explosives. And when this happens, we can know that the point of this deal will be useless as we are trying to make sure that Iran denuclearizes these bombs, right? But then they're still doing this under the agreement, and they're still doing this no matter how, and they're still doing this even if this deal is being imposed, which only proves that the point of this deal is useless and it doesn't benefit or help US or the entire world. And my second point is that US pulling out of this agreement and this deal is an even better alternative than leaving out all sanctions, because when US pulls out, they get to impose heavy sanctions on Iran, which means that they will be able to control what goes in, what goes out. They're able to look over what Iran is doing. They're able to look over on whether Iran is still doing whatever, like still developing bombs and doing continuing research. Okay, and if And if US were to like remove these sanctions and let Iran continue to say that they're going to denuclearize these bombs, it will only be worse for everyone in the future because it doesn't make Iran a non-nuclear country, but instead this deal is rather a useless thing where you cannot really say that Iran is exactly going to follow whatever that this deal is implemented. So in conclusion, I strongly believe that this deal doesn't even bring any more benefits, doesn't really help both sides of the countries because we already know that Iran still does nuclearizing explosives and bombs like that, even with this deal in place. And US pulling out and imposing heavy sanctions is way better than US than the deal itself because this allows US to control whatever you like to be able to look over and see whatever Iran is doing, which is even better in my opinion. And with that, I strongly like to end my case. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. Now we'll have the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close the opening half of this debate.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hello? Okay. I will start anytime now. For POIs, please interrupt me. I'll be using a timer. Hold on. Side government tries to push to you that basically these sanctions are the only way for them to control whatever Iran does and to control the activities that Iran goes on, right? We tell you that this is very, very wrong, and we tell you that it's going to harm not only Iran, but it's going to harm other countries as well, right? Which I'll be proving to you in my speech. Firstly, what is this? Gulf comes up and tells you that this US pulling out and these heavy sanctions can control research and development when they have sanctions in Iran. She doesn't tell us how this happens at all. When you have sanctions, suddenly you can control the research and development. She doesn't tell us anything. She doesn't tell us anything about this at all. No mechanization whatsoever. So I cannot rebut it at all. But besides that, she also told you that it stops it doesn't that this check and balance of the Iran deal does not stop Iran from making nuclear weapons, right? Let me prove to you how that is wrong. Because firstly, understand that this Strait of Hormuz, where oil goes through, is a very, very a powerful it's a very, very very resourceful thing for Iran, right? Iran gets a lot of money by doing exports with other countries, by exporting oil to other countries, right? Understand that it's one of their main sources of income. By losing this main source of income, it causes their economy to drop really, really bad, right? We tell you when this economy is dropped really, really bad, is when they will want to keep their promise or stop denuclearizing, even if their sanctions are released and if their sanctions taken away, if the sanctions are taken away. We tell you that by putting sanctions on them and by continuously putting sanctions on them, there is no particular threat that forces them to stop denuclearizing in the first place. There is no threat that forces them to stop denuclearizing, and therefore they can continue denuclearizing because they know that US isn't going to release its sanctions anyway. If the US releases its sanctions, then it knows that the threat of US putting sanctions back again may come back and may affect this country. So when it has a chance to improve its country, it will improve its country with the trade-off of denuclearizing, right? We tell you that is how a check and balance is done, where they can trade off where Iran can trade off this nuclearization for the economy of its country. No, but let me tell you how Iran suffers because of this, right? We tell you that Iran suffers a lot because of the fact that because when you put sanctions on Iran, Iran's economy drops a lot, right? Because the because now they cannot export oil to other countries, because now they are unable to export oil, because every time they export oil they have to pay so much, right? And because of this, right, we tell you that their economy drops a lot, and their economy drops a lot, right? The people in Iran are suffering because of the fact that US continues to just put sanctions on Iran no matter what, right? Continues to put sanctions on Iran while Iran continues to make nuclear arms, and while this goes on, the people of Iran are suffering because they're unable to get some form of money to eat in the first place, right? They cannot get some form of money to live in the first place. Because of this is because of the fact that Iran's economy has dropped and it cannot cater for its people as well as it used to, so that its funds is have so that the funds that it has is allocated less towards the people in the first place, right? We tell you that Iran's people will be Iran will get less money in the first place, right? But then there is another harm, right? We tell you that US then loses the support of a lot of countries, and it causes a lot of countries to go against US in the first place, right? Understand that Iran exports a lot of oil to a lot of other countries, like through the Strait of Hormuz. Includes China, this includes Turkey, this includes France, and so on, right? When it transports oil to all of them, when there are sanctions placed, what Iran did and he did before was it
Your
stopped
sir.
these oil tankers. No, it stopped these oil tankers from entering Iran in order to get oil and so on. So because of this, these oil tankers cannot come into the Strait of Hormuz to get oil in the first place, which causes the supply of oil to be less in the first place. When the supply of oil is less, the demand of oil is higher. This causes the price of oil to go to rise in other places of the world, right? Because the Strait of Hormuz, because Iran really handles a lot of oil, really gives out a lot of oil, right? It's one of the biggest exporters of oil. But we tell you that because this, the price of oil in other countries rises a lot, and it causes other countries like China and France and Turkey to be really, really angry of US because of the fact that these sanctions have caused Iran to block their way to block these oil tankers because Iran wants to send a message to the countries that they are exporting to please stand up to US because US is taking a toll on them, because US is placing sanctions on them, which is why countries like China which is why countries like China refuse to trade with US, which is why other countries are not allies with US anymore, right? We tell you that you lose the support of these countries, and that is very, very harmful to you because you can't get support to control Iran in the first place, right? But then we tell you also that there are a lot of holes in Christopher's speech, right? Because Christopher also told you how there's sovereignty when Iran is not on a leash, right? We tell you that that's not the point, right? The point of the debate is to keep Iran on a leash so that it stops making its nuclear weapons and so on. Yes, maybe they'll continue to make some form of nuclear weapons because the government cannot control these certain military groups and so on. But that is far smaller the scale than compared to when you let these sanctions happen and you let them nuclearize and so on. When the scale is far smaller, it takes a longer time for them to make nuclear weapons, and when it takes a longer time for them to make nuclear weapons, they can't make nuclear weapons that fast, and US is ready to counter them anytime, right? That means that the nuclear weapons will not be ready at all and anytime soon, right? That means they do not pose a time-sensitive threat towards US in the first place, towards other countries in the first place, right? We tell you that they also told you that Iran is forced into this deal because of the fact that US is more powerful than them. Correct. That is how US keeps them in check, because US has more power than them. US has a higher amount of military than them. So they know if a war breaks out between Iran and US, then US will definitely be able to take them down, right? We don't see what's wrong with this because US poses a threat to them, and we tell you that Iran is okay with that because they know that US can come against them anytime possible, right? We tell you that we've taken down OG's case, but why does OO's case why is OO's case really better, right? Because we told you how US loses the support of many other countries when they impose these sanctions, right? We also told you how they harm the people of Iran who are not responsible for any of this when they place sanctions, right? And thirdly, what my PM told you, you caused Iran to be a hell of a loose cannon because you caused them to be able to attack you at any time. Thank you. Hello, I'm done.
Yeah, hello. ADC, I'm done.
Yeah.
Yep, I'm done.
Because I couldn't come. Anyways, thank you for that speech, and now we'll move on to the member of government. You have the floor.
Okay, hi, am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you pretty well.
Okay, cool. Give me a moment. Yeah, I'm gonna go drink my water and set my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think on both opening side, there's lack of characterization as to how Iran looks like as a country or how sanctions actually work. And believe me, it's way more than just economic sanctions. A few characterization. Iran as a country is an authoritarian country ruled by Islamic clerics where human rights has been suppressed and any voices of dissent are stifled. Various nations, particularly liberal democracies, openly condemn Iran and its oppressive government. Sanctions, on the meanwhile, are coercive and punitive actions taken on specific states. Sanctions range from diplomatic sanction, which results in the closing of embassies, to economic sanction, which limits sectors of the target state's economy, or even weapon embargo. The debate has been very messy on the opening side, so let me simplify it. Sanctions are effective, and the continued development of nuclear weapons are not as harmful as side-by-side opposition here. Let's stop talking about the interests of the US or Iran or China, whoever, but talk about those that are affected the most by Iran's isolationist and anti-Western policy, the citizens themselves. So my first argument and my only argument would be how this advanced human rights, and because there's an incentive as a result. Keep in mind that Iran is supported by a lot of authoritarian countries and that the JCPOA has opened up Iran's economy. But the problem with that is that how the government there functions. Just because you boost the economy, that doesn't mean that the revenue earned are going to the people, when many in the clerical political party and Islamic advancements are funded significantly higher than basic welfare like housing or food. Because the Iranian government has an incentive to stay in power, and even if it means that people's lives are at stake, what matters is that a lot more are going to be indoctrinated with anti-Western and Islamic conservative sentiments. So that's the biggest problem with the JCPOA. There are little to no oversight as to how the Iranian government is going to spend that money on things like welfare, especially when obedience to the government is at an all-time high and when government wrongdoings are rarely called out. You need to keep in mind that appeasement cannot work simply because of the usage of those revenues are under no transparent oversight. But then there's also the concern of nuclear weapons. Okay, keep in mind that developing nuclear weapons require resources and money, significant ones. Okay, of course they can rely on Russia and their allies, but it's not sustainable. You can only develop it to a certain extent, and even after that, it cannot number the amount of nuclear weapons of NATO. The MAD doctrine, when destruction will be mutually assured, will be good enough deterrence for Iran and their allies not to use or even threaten the use of these nuclear weapons because it guarantees far more destruction to Iran. There are no reasons whatsoever for Iran to attack the US and its allies, especially when the MAD doctrine will also mean that such attack will be reciprocated by the US at a much greater scale. Perhaps they will say that it will cripple the economy, okay? That's something that they say. But look at the long run here. When sufficient pressure applied will make countries have cave in sooner or later rather than waiting for an inevitable military invention. If such pressures are neglected, and Iran will continue to develop the nuclear weapon and use it to attack or threaten neighboring nations. But what else? We say that Iran uses revenue and military weapons to perpetuate human rights violation. When we impose weapons embargo as a result, we say that it decreases the amount of weapons that can be used to stifle dissent and allow for more liberalization in Iran. Most diplomatic most diplomatic negotiation occur behind closed doors, and it has been hypothesized that if sanctions are going to be effective, it is the threat of the sanctions that forces the country to concede, not the sanctions themselves. That said, if sanctions were never followed through, that threat will be meaningless. The uses of sanction build up the fear of sanction. This fear can bend countries towards the will of the sanctioning nation to maintain the threat of sanctions as a viable negotiating tool. Sanctions used to be implemented on occasion to prevent sanctions from becoming an empty, meaningless threat. Although they do indeed hurt ordinary people here, in the long term, this can create appropriate pressure on government. When people are suffering enough at the hands of the government, they're more likely to take action. In Egypt and Tunisia, the governments are getting richer and the people are getting poorer, leading to the protest of regime changes. Sanction worked in South Africa and in former Rhodesia. It is true that they can lead to the mass suffering of these very people that they are designed to help, but as they did to the black population of South Africa, yet this sanction creates necessary internal pressure for regime change. By the utilitarian standard, we say that it is just to help the most people, the current suffering of some due to sanction is all outweighed by the future freedom to all citizens. therefore justified and thought they hurt the people as well as the leader of the country. But wouldn't the lifting of sanction be more beneficial because of free trade? Here's the problem with that. Free trade does not guarantee democracy or any sort of freedom and causes bargaining countries to lose leverage. In order to increase their own wealth, most welcome free trade. Once they have been accepted into the future arena, the West no longer has any leverage on them. But how does this advance human rights then? Two reasons for that. First, the internal pressure when applied over and over again to the point the governments of Western nations simply because the economy by then would be so crippled to the point that people will see the government as no longer legitimate the longer these sanctions are applied. In order to legitimize the government and stay in power, that Iran demands, they do want to have a grip on power, and if that's the only way possible, so be it. Second, acknowledge that the fact that Western countries do have more political and financial leverage as compared to the rest of the world. And it's because of that we said that under the JCPOA, that leverage disappears. And do keep in mind that the JCPOA can expire, and what happens after that is unpredictable. And at worst case scenario, continue the development of nuclear weapons in Iran. And second of all, a lack of transparency and international oversight over the management of these funds, because the UN cannot interfere based on the respect of the sovereignty of each nation. On our side, we say we are so much more willing to treat instability in Iran if it means that in the future, human rights of persecuted individuals are respected and that Iran will open up its economy via concession. This is why we won the debate today. Opening government really talks about Iran and the US and not those that are affected by these sanctions, ordinary Iranian citizens. It is all for government to assume how Iran will react to the JCPOA, no matter how valid the argument are. Well, on the our side, we said that free trade right now doesn't necessarily work, how it allows for more leverage for Western nations to pressure Iran to liberalize both its society and its economy. No, thank you. It's over time. Sorry. How sanctions are effective in applying pressure, even if people suffer in the short term. How the continued development of nuclear weapons are bounded to a certain extent and not sustainable in the long run. How there are strong deterrents for Iran not to attack the US, and lastly, how it allows for the advancement of human rights and dissidents that are executed or prosecuted simply for voicing out. Lives are at stake here, and many people striving for the most basic of human rights, the most fundamental of human rights, are denied those rights and return home bloodied or even dead. Let's not play around here and let's not talk about the JCPOA or whatever, because right now the main stakeholder of this debate has been neglected. Ordinary Iranian citizens suffering under the Iranian government. It is unfair for the opening side to keep talking about the interests of the US or Iran, especially when those that are most affected by these policies are not US or Iran, but rather the people under US or Iran. And that is why I'm very proud to propose the motion today. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. Now we'll move on to the member of opposition. You can start when you're ready.
I would first like to begin by saying this is clearly a closing debate because opening government and opening opposition have failed to recognize the most important points in this debate, which is what's most important right now is the reputation of US, which has already been teetering from people not willing to support. And also the idea that our citizens in Ireland are suffering. Can you hear me now?
Your voice is very choppy, so it keeps breaking off like every minute. Is it the same problem for everyone?
Can I restart?
It's also inaudible for me. Can you keep trying, please?
Okay. So firstly, I would like to begin by saying that this is clearly a closing debate, as opening houses have failed to recognize that, firstly, what's most important in this debate is, in fact, the needs and wants of Ireland and US citizens, along with citizens around the globe. Some rebuttals for the House today. I would like to start by saying that closing proposition and closing government has already conceded to our points on several occasions, such as saying that developing nuclear weapons requires money, and how destruction caused by nuclear weapons would deter Iran from developing such nuclear weapons or actually sending them out into the world to cause destruction. this concedes to our point, as we believe that this deterrence of how they would not use their nuclear weapons would actually be more beneficial on our side, especially if we are able to forge better connections with them. If we connect with them better, obviously they will be less willing to try and attack us or literally any other country. They will be more deterred by the destruction that will be caused. And I quote from what closing government said: lifting of sanctions would be beneficial. Who were the ones who imposed such sanctions on Iran? US. US broke their promise and continued to impose sanctions. Sure, that maybe Iran first broke the deal by continuing their nuclear research and continuing to create such nuclear bombs. But the problem is that if even if Iran did not continue developing such nuclear weapons, would Trump not have continued imposing such sanctions on them during his rule? Regardless of whether or not Iran is continued first broke the deal, what's most important currently is that US has more power over Iran than Iran does over US. Now this was considered by closing government, as they said that lifting of sanctions will be beneficial on terms of opposition on what my house believes in.
UI, ma'am.
No, thank you. Moving on, closing government also said that Iran citizens are suffering, which my house agrees with, and it's also the reason why removing of such sanctions would be beneficial will cause more harm, will cause more good than harm. Moving on to what the opening houses say. Firstly, what opening houses say that is that Iran participated in nuclear research in 2011 and that sets the deal for Iran deal, and how eventually Iran broke that and eventually so did Trump. But the problem is this deal in the first place, if these sanctions erodes the trust between US citizens and Biden, because if Biden does not remove Biden in the first place, he was elected to represent what the US citizens wanted, which was not what Trump wanted. Trump was the one who imposed such sanctions on Iran, and thus people did not want that. And what opening government has stated is that people wanted the sanctions, which is clearly not true. Otherwise, Trump would have been re-elected. And additionally, they also said that citizens around the globe do not agree with such sentiments, and that is simply not true. Because if the citizens from around the globe agreed with the sanctions, UN in the first place wouldn't have agreed with the removal of the sanctions. They wouldn't have agreed with the deal in the first place. And another thing which opening gov stated was that the Iran deal is beneficial to only US, but that is not true, because the United Nations never would have allowed it to pass if it only benefited the United States. They also stated that Iran is the number one culprit because Iran was the one who continued the nuclear research. Yes, that is true, but think of it from Iran's perspective. If Iran did not feel threatened, if they felt safe, they would not have continued to research. These nuclear weapons are for them. In order for them to protect themselves, they need these nuclear weapons. And if they felt safe in the first place, they would not have a need to continue building these. What we need right now is a trustful relationship between both Iran and US and the rest of the globe. It's better on our side of the world, or in our paradigm, because it enables Biden to appear as savior to America and to the rest of the world. This is the type of positive press and news that we need to surround US, especially due to Trump's hostile approach during his rule and the current failure of the US to handle COVID and several other movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement. We need to prove that Biden will be better suited at leading, and what better way than for him to officially take on the role which he accepted.
UI, sir.
No. Firstly, for example, Biden's whole party revolved around undoing the mistakes that Trump has made. For example, how he stopped the construction of the wall between Mexico and US. Now, this is a prime example of when Biden tried to win the trust that Trump had lost back for the US. Now, why would the removal of sanctions that Trump imposed be beneficial. Now, firstly, a lot of people were actually against US continuing to continuing to impose such sanctions. Currently, opening government has stated that we cannot prove that Iran will not.
Please.
No, thank you. Opening government has stated that we have no proof that Iran will not continue to nuclearize themselves, but they also have no proof that Iran would not stop nuclearizing. Secondly, they also said that Iran can't control their people, but currently COVID period shows that no one can control their citizens, especially now that, especially not US. The nature of UN passing resolutions is that they need 2/3 majority, which further proves that the globe actually did not agree with what Trump wanted. And also, US couldn't keep themselves the sanctions. Trump brought it back on them, and if, like I said before, they wouldn't be nuclearized if they were sure that US would not reimpose their sanctions. Firstly, on both sides, we cannot be sure that Iran will denuclearize, but at least on our side, we are trying to keep a friendly relationship with Iran and build our trust with them rather than causing more harm. Thus, additionally, I would like to develop on the point which closing government has said for us, and is that people living in Iran are still human and they still deserve human rights. If US broke the deal first, what gives US the right to control Iran? My second speaker will continue on these points. Therefore, I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that speech, and now we'll move on to the final speaker from government side, which is the whip. So you have the floor. You can start when you're ready.
Hello. Is my Wi-Fi good? Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you right.
Okay. Yeah, my pronouns are he, him, and I go by, and like I prefer my POIs like verbal. So like please interrupt me during my speech. Okay. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Want to know what government side did to benefit the citizens of the Middle East, as well as de-escalating the tensions between US and Iran? Iran from the JCPOA, pun intended. Or rather, we ran from the JCPOA. And that's for a multitude of reasons as to why, on our side, we sanction Iran rather than, implementing this very useless deal. So the crux of this debate lies between two clashes. Number one, who better benefits the Iran citizens socially? That I feel like both sides of opposition, as well as like the closing, kind of completely dismiss this and only focus on like the two main powerhouses, as well as the second clash, the de-escalation of tensions between Iran, US and as well as like other global superpowers. But before that, I'd like to move on to my like 5 rebuttals. Number one, opening opposition came out to you and say how Iran has no obligation to actually to not continue these new researchers due to the lack of deal. On our side, we say this is completely untrue, mainly because it requires a lot of resources. Understand that new funding takes a lot of resources to implement. And then furthermore, using weapons like nukes already on an already strong country like the US and NATO, it's already a really scary thing to do. It's a really ballsy thing to do. That my member already brought up about MAD doctrine, where mutual destruction will happen on both sides. Yes, sir.
Okay, why does your side want to create havoc in Iran when they already have a stable government?
Wait, hold on. All right, I'll answer that later on in my like rebuttals. But like, okay. And then not to mention when Iran has like the obligation, when Iran has no obligation to not continue these kinds of deals, understand that there's also an ethical cost behind using those nukes on other countries. And even if you implement these deals, the opening government already brought out how there's already how Iran already were already implementing nukes, were already researching nukes in secret regardless. Second rebuttal, how opposition came out into you, how and said that Iran deal, how US can't control Iran anymore. On our side, which is completely false, because understand the main thing sanctions are doing is to control them, especially its policies. By getting rid of this deal and by implementing sanctions, this is much more aggressive and hard stance of us being able to control Iran. Next, and how furthermore, how they also talk about how with this, how thanks to the JCPOA, Iran can make better deals. But here's the thing: if they really did care about Iran making better trades and deals, understand that if they had more nuclear power, they'd be able to pressure surrounding countries with nukes who have no military power, who are not part of NATO, who have no military backing, and forcing them to trade. But this is completely unethical, but still will happen if they actually did care about Iran trades. That or the other authoritarian countries that my member already brought up, like Russia, who will only further ostracize Iran from global and continental superpowers because of how aggressive Iran is. Then they touched on this briefly, but opposition talked about how Iran's people will suffer. But even though my member already brought how it's not like Iran's funding went to its people regardless. Most of its funding already went to its nuclear researchers. And not to mention, Iran's already characterized as a really oppressive government and not a democratic one. Then yes, ma'am.
Firstly, I would like to ask whether you are are you saying that US is not aggressive and hostile at all? What about what US did to Iraq?
The reason why US is sanctioning Iraq in the first place, okay, we concede to the fact that yes, the main stakeholders of this debate is Iran's people. So sure, US is aggressive, but US is aggressive for good reasons. Next, on Iran's people, understand that by literally implementing sanctions, we're pressuring them to further develop and become a democratic country to help its citizens more. So on the two clashes of this debate, who better the Iranian citizens? Opposition came out and said how its sanctions are already really hard for people, especially for economically, for all the sorts of reasons. On our side, we say that yes, sure, in the short term now, that will obviously happen. On our side, we said with Iran being able to develop, we can, by sanctioning them, we allow them to develop and focus their more resources via interfering with policies or helping more other people, and how it will end up becoming more democratic, i.e. allowing people females to in Iran to have basic human rights. OG also touched on this slightly about terrorism and whatnot, but our side says that this is much more important because they are the ones, the Iranian citizens are the most affected by this. So not only are we principally better by allowing them to for the long run in the future, but also turn Iranian governments switching from a really authoritarian state to a democratic state. Next to the big clash that opposition was fighting over, about the escalation of tension. So opposition talked about how they didn't want to piss off Iran, how Iran can make better trades, and how there's a check and balance. Even though thanks to my member and my rebuttals already prove why this is completely not the case. And yeah, sure, the escalation of warheads exists on Iran, and US has NATO. Understand what NATO is. NATO is a collection of some of the superpowers in our world, like France, Luxembourg, Canada. If you attack US, what will happen? Mad will happen. But not only mad, it will be even more terrible on Iran's side, because now every single member will attack you. Understand that the war weapons on our side are much more better than Iran's nukes. So we benefit both US, OG already thought how about this will benefit US. And then they also talk about how this will benefit Iran. On topic of Iran, now Iran, upon realizing how detrimental their nukes are, and especially how sanctions continuously rising in the long run, via pressure that my member already brought up, sanctions affecting them. Now Iran has to cave in and actually help its people by that through democratic means, via protests as well that happen on our side. And even if this is not the case, understand that via sanctions, US finally now has a way to implement its policies to turn it into a democratic government, and which is the down step that US is actually taking now. And now we are allocating its funds towards its people, and how US is already implementing its policies. So the crux of this debate is essentially how we can benefit the Iranian citizens more, and which is what our side has already proven to you. And as to why, even though this is a very hard approach on our side, we say this is better for the long term, because in the long term future on our side, we help benefit the Iranian citizens more by making it democratic. Whereas on their side, the law is implemented and you literally tell them that, hey, you can do whatever you want to us. And this is why we win the debate. Here.
Thank you for that speech. We'll move on to the final speaker of this round, which is the op whip. Op whip. Give me a second. Yeah, I think you can start when you're ready.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, starting on my speech proper, the entire argument of opening government is about how Iran is unstable because some of the people in their country have broke the deal and how the government is unable to control their people. Now let me ask you this. What government can specifically control everyone in the country? That's right. There is none of them. So by your definition, are you trying to say that all the countries in the world have no proper government in the first place? Because that is what you are implying in the first place. Now, you are saying that Iran is unstable as well because they broke the deal, but you are failing to recognize that so did the US. You are just trying to ignore that the US also broke their deal just because it fits your argument and it is in your favor. And as such, why I think your entire argument is flawed in that aspect. Why I think opening government and closing government have flaws in their speech, why certain part and thus why their arguments are invalid in a sense. Now, this entire debate, no one has been looking at this on a more global scale, right? All of you have been focusing on, the relations between United Nations, the United States and Iran. Now, recognize that by the US continuing on in that deal and re-implementing it, it will improve the relations between between most of the countries in the world and the United States. Now, before this whole thing, most of the countries in the world have already agreed to this deal, which shows that they are supporting of it. But when Trump went back on his word, this caused the other countries to, have a bad image of them. And now US has a bad image about them in the first place. Now, the only way to, there is a way to redeem this reputation, and that is via re-implementing this deal and following through on it. This way, with a new president and everything like that, the US will be able to redeem their reputation, which is what Joe Biden himself has promised to do for his people. And as such, why I think this deal will bring more benefits in that area. Recognize that in all of this, Iran is the victim. The US is simply a big country with guns and everything who can control Iran, who thinks that just because they are better and bigger than Iran, that they can control what they can and cannot do. They are trying to ask Iran to denuclearize, which is completely hypocritical of them to do, considering that US currently is the top country which has consistently been testing and has been in possession of nuclear weapons in the first place. So I ask you, would it not be quite hypocritical for the US want to be the only one who possesses these nuclear weapons? And as such, why I think that they are being too harsh on Iran in the first place. And even if they want Iran to get rid of their nuclear weapons, they should be able to follow through on their deal, considering that they are so selective with who they want to target
UI, please.
What?
Under your side, how do you guarantee that the advancement of human rights in Iran will be more probable than under our side?
Way that Trump has run the US so far. Now, closing government. You have said that US is aggressive for good reasons only when my speaker had POI'd you. Now, I disagree with this, and I think we can all disagree with this in saying that US only only is aggressive for their own personal interest, and that your own first speaker even said that US is not ever aggressive for good reasons. So I don't know really what's going on there between you and your first speaker, but that's what I have to say about that. Now, you have also said that Iran is the number one culprit in this whole nuclear weapon thing. Now, let me tell you why this is not true. Number one, that Iran is simply using these nuclear weapons as a defense mechanism. So even if you want them to get rid of their nuclear weapons because you're scared of it and everything, you can't really fault them for having these kinds of nuclear weapons. And especially the US cannot fault them for having these kinds of weapons, considering what they have in their country in the first place. So, and for all these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
Okay, that brings us to an end of the quarterfinals for this round, and thank you so much for debating her. And we'll get to know the results, I think, in the main hall. So it would be great if all of you could cross your hands and leave the room so the judges can deliberate.
Good debate, everyone.